The heavy scent of funeral lilies always made me nauseous, but as I sat in the back of my mother-in-law's black SUV, the smell was suffocating, competing with the metallic salt of my own tears. Elena gripped the steering wheel with a terrifying intensity, her knuckles white, as she told me that the bank had already seized our home to cover Mark's mounting medical debts and that I had exactly 20 minutes to board my flight before the life I knew completely vanished. It was only when the car screeched away from the curb at the airport, leaving me standing there with nothing but a carry-on and a broken heart, that a cold realization pierced through my grief. I had left my passport in the hidden floorboard of our master bedroom, the one place Elena had screamed I must never return to under the threat of legal ruin. But to understand how I ended up on that cold, rain-slicked curb at Terminal 4, clutching a one-way ticket to a city I hadn't lived in for a decade, you have to understand the life we had built, or the life I thought we had built. 3 years ago, Mark and I bought the old Miller estate. It was a crumbling Victorian lady on the edge of town, overgrown with ivy and filled with the ghosts of 100 years of history. To anyone else, it was a money pit, but to me, it was a sanctuary. I remember the day we moved in. The air smelled of cedar shavings and the faint, sweet scent of the lavender bushes I'd planted near the porch. "It's a lot of work, Sarah," Mark had said, wiping a smudge of soot from my cheek as we stood in the drafty foyer. His eyes were so warm then, full of a devotion that felt like an unbreakable shield. "Are you sure you want to spend our entire savings on a house that needs a new spine?" I had laughed, leaning into his chest. "It doesn't need a new spine, Mark. It just needs a heart. We're the heart." And for a long time, we were. Our mornings were a choreographed dance of domestic bliss. I would wake up early to the sound of the percolator bubbling in the kitchen, the sunlight filtering through the original stained glass windows and casting rubies and emeralds across our hardwood floors. Mark would come up behind me while I brewed my coffee, his hands resting on my hips, whispering about the blueprints for the wraparound porch we were planning. We spent our weekends covered in paint and drywall dust, laughing over takeout pizza on the floor of what would eventually be the nursery. Then there was Elena. Mark's mother didn't enter our lives with a bang. She seeped in like a slow leak in the basement. At first, she was just the concerned widow who lived 10 minutes away. She would show up unannounced with Tupperware containers of heavy, over-salted stews and suggestions for the renovation. "It's so drafty in here, Sarah dear," she'd say, her eyes scanning our hard work with a clinical coldness. She always wore pearls, even when she was just sitting on our plastic-covered sofa. "A woman of your delicate constitution shouldn't be living in a construction zone. Mark, tell her, you should have bought that condo in the city, the one near my bridge club." Mark would always give me that look, the just humor her look, and squeeze my hand under the table. "Mom, Sarah loves this house. It's her heritage. Her grandmother's land was just 2 miles from here. She's not delicate. She's a builder." I appreciated his defense, but even back then, I noticed how he never actually told her to stop. He never told her to knock before entering. He never told her that her constant questions about our finances, about whose name was on the deed, and how much my inheritance from my father had covered, were intrusive. "I just want to make sure you're protected, Marky," she would coo, smoothing his hair as if he were 5 instead of 35. In this economy, with Sarah not working while she focuses on the house, everything falls on your shoulders. It's a heavy burden for a son to carry alone. I wasn't not working. I was a freelance architectural restorer, taking commissions that allowed me to be present for the contractors and do the delicate woodwork myself. But in Elena's eyes, if I wasn't in an office from 9 to 5, I was a refined squatter in her son's castle. The first real crack appeared 6 months ago during a dinner that should have been a celebration. We had finally finished the master suite. The fireplace was restored, the clawfoot tub was installed, and the room felt like a dream. "To the house," I said, raising my glass of wine. "To the house," Mark echoed, his voice slightly strained. Elena didn't raise her glass. She set her fork down with a deliberate click against the china. It's a lovely room, Sarah. Truly. It's just a shame about the taxes. I saw the assessment in the mail when I stopped by to drop off the linens yesterday. It's quite a jump. Are you sure you can handle that, Mark? Especially with the complications at the firm? I froze, the wine turning sour on my tongue. What complications, Mark? Mark avoided my gaze, spinning his wedding band around his finger, a nervous habit I'd grown to loathe. It's nothing, Sarah. Just a few delayed contracts. Mom is just being a bit dramatic. I am being practical, Elena snapped, her facade of sweetness slipping for a fraction of a second. A man needs a safety net. I've told you, Mark, we should look into the trust. It would simplify everything. It would make sure the house stays in the family no matter what happens. The way she said family excluded me so sharply it felt like a physical slap. I looked at the walls I had sanded with my own 2 hands, the floorboards I had polished until they shone, and for the first time, the house felt cold. The house is in both our names, Elena, I said, my voice steady despite the thumping of my heart. It is family property, our family. She smiled then, a thin paper cut of a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course, dear. I just hope it stays that way. Life is so very unpredictable, isn't it? I didn't know then that she wasn't making a casual observation. She was making a promise. I didn't know that the complications Mark mentioned were actually a spiraling web of debt he was hiding, or that Elena was already standing in the shadows, holding the scissors, waiting for the right moment to snip the threads of my life. I just leaned back into the velvet chair I'd found at an estate sale and watched the firelight dance, unaware that in a few short months the man across from me would be declared dead, and the woman next to him would be driving me to an airport to ensure I never found out why. The weeks following that dinner felt as though the house itself was sensing an approaching storm. The air in our beautiful Victorian felt heavy, thick with things unsaid. Mark, once my rock, became a shadow. He started sleeping in the guest room, claiming his back couldn't handle our mattress anymore, but I knew it was his eyes he was protecting. He couldn't look at me. Every time our gazes met, he'd flinch as if I were a bright light he wasn't ready to face. Elena, meanwhile, became a ghost that refused to leave. She was there when I woke up, sitting at my kitchen table, sipping tea and organizing our mail. She began to take over the household accounts, claiming that since Mark was struggling with the firm's paperwork, she was merely stepping in as a devoted mother. "You don't understand the pressure he's under, Sarah," she whispered one afternoon, her voice like sandpaper. We were in the kitchen, and she was meticulously shredding a stack of envelopes. The rhythmic zip, zip, zip of the shredder made my skin crawl. A man's pride is a fragile thing. If he knew you were worrying about the notice of default letters, it would break him. "Default?" I gasped, reaching for the pile. "Elena, what are you talking about? Our mortgage is paid months in advance. I used my father's inheritance for that." She pulled the papers away, her smile sharp and cold. "Oh, Sarah, you're so naive. Inheritances disappear quickly when a man is trying to keep a failing business afloat. Mark didn't want to tell you. He's been using the house as collateral for months." I confronted Mark that night. He was sitting in the dark of the den, the only light coming from his glowing phone screen. When I asked him about the default, he didn't deny it. He didn't even argue. He just sighed, a long, hollow sound that seemed to drain the life from the room. "I'll fix it, Sarah," he muttered, his voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Mom is helping. Just let her handle the paperwork. She knows people at the bank. Please, just trust us." The word us felt like a barricade. It wasn't us, the husband and wife. It was us, the mother and son. I felt a cold dread beginning to pool in my stomach, but I pushed it down. I loved him. I had to believe him. 3 days later, the nightmare truly began. I had been out at a restoration site across the state line when the call came. It was Elena. She wasn't speaking. She was wailing. a primal screeching sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to my marrow. "The bridge, Sarah! The rain, the car. They say there's no way anyone could have survived that fall into the ravine. Mark is gone. My boy is gone." The world didn't just go dark. It ceased to exist. I don't remember the drive home. I don't remember the police officers who supposedly spoke to me, or the identification process that Elena insisted on handling alone because she couldn't bear for me to see him like that. Within 48 hours, she had arranged a closed casket service and a cremation, citing a living will Mark had supposedly signed years ago. I was a walking corpse, fueled only by the sedatives she kept pressing into my hand. "The bank is taking the house tomorrow morning, Sarah," Elena whispered into my ear at the wake, her breath smelling of peppermint and calculated grief. "They won't even let you keep the furniture. I've bought you a ticket to your sister's in Seattle. You have to leave tonight. I'll handle the legalities. I'll save what I can, but you need to go before the bailiffs arrive. It's for your own dignity." I was too broken to fight. I let her pack my small carry-on. I let her lead me to the black SUV. I let her drive me to the airport, my mind a static-filled void. But as I stood at the terminal, watching her taillights disappear into the rain, a sudden, sharp clarity pierced through the fog of my grief. My passport. I had hidden it months ago in a velvet-lined compartment beneath a loose floorboard in the master bedroom, along with my mother's wedding ring and the original deed to the house. I couldn't leave the country, or my past, without it. I didn't call an Uber. I took a local taxi, the driver giving me worried glances in the rearview mirror as I stared blankly out at the passing trees. I didn't have my keys. Elena had lost them in the chaos. But I knew the house. I knew the mudroom window with the loose latch behind the ivy. I climbed through the window, my breath hitching in the silence. The house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt occupied. There were no moving boxes, no signs of a bank seizure. The air smelled of fresh coffee and expensive cigars. I crept up the stairs, my heart drumming a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I reached the master bedroom and knelt by the vanity, my fingers trembling as I pried up the floorboard. My passport was there, but beneath it was a thick manila envelope I hadn't placed there. I opened it, and the world began to tilt. Inside was a transfer of title deed. It was dated 2 months ago. It bore my signature, a perfect, chilling forgery, and Mark's. It transferred the entire Miller estate to a holding company owned by Elena, but it was the second document that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a life insurance confirmation, a $5 million payout. Beneficiary, Elena Vance. And clipped to the back were 2 first-class boarding passes to Cabo San Lucas, one for Elena Vance and one for Mark Vance, both dated for tomorrow morning. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to lean against the bed frame to keep from collapsing. My lungs felt like they were collapsing. The grief that had been crushing me for 3 days suddenly curdled into something hot, sharp, and terrifying. Then I heard it. The sound of a door opening downstairs, a laugh, a low, masculine chuckle that I would know in the middle of a crowded stadium. It was the sound of the man I had mourned, the man I thought was ashes in an urn on Elena's mantle. Did she get on the flight? The voice was Mark's. It was clear, vibrant, and utterly devoid of the death he had faked. "She's halfway to Seattle by now," Elena's voice rang out, triumphant and cold. "The poor little fool didn't even ask to see the police report. I told you, Mark. She was always too soft. Now pour the champagne. We have a lot to celebrate." I sat on the floor of our bedroom, clutching the evidence of my own erasure, listening to my husband toast to my departure with the woman who had helped him bury me alive. My hands weren't trembling anymore. They were cold as the revenge I knew in that moment I was going to take. The sound of a champagne cork popping downstairs sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the house. I stood at the top of the stairs, the manila envelope clutched so tightly against my chest that the edges of the paper dug into my skin. Every step down the grand staircase, The staircase I had spent 40 hours hand-sanding until the mahogany glowed like wine felt like I was descending into a different dimension. I reached the doorway of the dining room. The scene inside was a grotesque parody of the celebrations we used to have. Elena was leaning against the sideboard, a crystal flute in her hand, her eyes bright with a feverish, triumphant light. And there sat Mark. He was wearing his favorite cashmere sweater, the one I'd bought him for our anniversary. He looked healthy. He looked vibrant. He looked alive. The glass in Mark's hand froze halfway to his lips. His eyes met mine, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Then his hand began to shake. The champagne sloshed over the rim, droplets landing on his hand like melted wax. "Sarah," he breathed. It wasn't a greeting. It was a plea, or perhaps a prayer to a god he had already betrayed. Elena turned, her face twisting from a smile into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She didn't even have the decency to look shocked for more than a second. She just set her glass down with a sharp clack. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice dropping an octave into something reptilian. "You're supposed to be on that plane. You're supposed to be gone." "I forgot my passport," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, low, hollow, and frighteningly calm. I held up the manila envelope, but I found something much more interesting. I found the $5 million price tag you put on my husband's life, and I found the man who sold it to you. I looked at Mark. I waited for the explanation. I waited for him to jump up, to tell me he'd been held captive, that he'd been forced, that he'd been drugged. But he just sat there, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on a singular crumb on the tablecloth. This was the moment of silence I had dreaded, the vacuum where his love for me was supposed to be. "Mark, look at me," I commanded. He didn't move. He looked like a man made of gray ash. "He did it for us, you ungrateful girl." Elena stepped forward, interposing herself between me and her son, like a dragon guarding its hoard. He was drowning. Do you have any idea how much debt this shrine of yours put him in? The firm was collapsing because he was spending every waking hour worrying about your demands for authentic Victorian hardware and imported tiles. "I paid for the renovations with my own money, Elena," I said, my voice rising. "I have the receipts. I have the bank statements." "Oh, did you?" She laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "Twist number one, Sarah dear. Those investments you thought you were making? Mark was diverting them into his personal trading account for years. He lost your father's inheritance in the first 6 months of our marriage. He's been living on my credit cards and my mercy ever since." I felt the room tilt. The air felt thin, as if the house were being vacuum sealed. I looked at Mark, my mouth agape. "Mark, is that true?" Finally, he looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with a pathetic, watery self-pity that made my stomach turn. "I was going to win it back, Sarah. I just needed more time. Everything was so expensive. The house, the life you wanted." "The life I wanted?" I whispered. "We lived in a construction zone for 3 years. I wore thrift store clothes so we could afford the copper piping. You lied to me for 3 years." "He did what he had to do," Elena snapped, her eyes narrowing. "And then came the hit and run. That's twist number 2, in case you're keeping track. Mark was driving home late after a business dinner, actually a bender at a casino, and he hit someone, a drifter. No family, no ID. Mark panicked. He called me." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. You used a human being's death to fake his own?" "It was a gift from Providence," Elena said, her voice devoid of any empathy. "We used the body to stage the accident. A little bit of DNA tampering, a very expensive consultant at the coroner's office, and suddenly Mark Vance is a tragic memory. The debt is wiped clean, and $5 million is waiting for us in a Bahamian account. We were going to start over, in Mexico. without the burden of a wife who asks too many questions. Mark finally spoke, his voice a pathetic whimper. "Sarah, please, if you just go to Seattle, I'll send you money. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Just don't destroy this, please." I looked at him, this shell of a man I had worshipped. He wasn't even mourning the person he killed. He was mourning the life of luxury he was about to lose. "And what about the cremation, Elena?" I asked, turning back to her. "Whose ashes are in that urn on your mantel? Some poor soul who had nobody to miss him?" "He was a nobody," she screamed, her composure finally breaking. She lunged toward me, her fingers clawing for the envelope. "Give me those papers. You're nothing. You're a penniless widow with no house and no husband. If you go to the police, I'll tell them you were in on it. I've spent months forging your signature on the insurance documents, too. You're just as guilty as we are." I stepped back, narrowly avoiding her grasp. My heel caught on the edge of the rug, and for a second I faltered. Elena saw the weakness and moved in, her face inches from mine, her breath hot and smelling of expensive wine. "Think about it, Sarah," she hissed, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly intimate whisper. "You have no proof that you didn't know. The police will see a wife who was losing her home and decided to cash in. You'll spend the rest of your life in a cell while I spend mine on a beach. Walk away. Take the flight. It's the only way you survive this." I looked past her at Mark. He was staring at the floor again, his silence a heavy, suffocating weight. He wasn't going to save me. He had never intended to save me. He was waiting for his mother to finish the job. "You're right, Elena," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and a new, icy clarity. "Life is very unpredictable." I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my phone. The screen was glowing. I had hit record the moment I stepped off the taxi. "And so are the police," I added. Elena's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled purple. She let out a guttural scream and lunged for the phone, her nails catching the skin of my wrist, drawing blood. But I wasn't the delicate girl she thought I was. I had spent 3 years tearing down walls and hauling lumber. I shoved her back with a strength that surprised even me, sending her sprawling against the dining table. "Mark!" she shrieked. "Do something! Get her!" Mark stood up, his face a mask of indecision and cowardice. He took one step toward me, his hands reaching out, whether to plead or to hurt me. I'll never know. Because at that moment, the blue and red lights of a patrol car began to pulse against the frosted glass of the front door, turning my beautiful restored foyer into a strobe-lit nightmare. I had called the police from the taxi, telling them there was an intruder in my home. I didn't know I would find a ghost and a monster instead. "Stay away from me, Mark," I said, my voice like a blade. "If you touch me, I'll make sure they don't just charge you with fraud. I'll make sure they charge you with murder." He froze, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides. The silent husband was finally broken, silenced by the very cowardice that had started this. As the heavy thud of the police knocking echoed through the house, I realized the woman I had been, the grieving, broken widow, had died at the airport, and the woman standing in her place was someone Elena and Mark should have been much, much more afraid of. The thudding at the door was no longer the sound of a threat. It was the sound of my life's architect finally laying the foundation for a house that wouldn't collapse. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break, it crystallized. The Sarah who had spent years shrinking herself to fit into the corners of Mark's ego and Elena's shadow was gone. In her place stood a woman who had just realized she was the only person in the room with nothing left to lose. "Officer, thank God you're here." Elena's voice transformed instantly, shifting from a venomous screech to the warble of a terrified elderly victim. She rushed toward the foyer as the police entered, her hands trembling with a practiced grace. "My daughter-in-law, she's had a breakdown. She's been hallucinating that my late son is alive. She's dangerous. She's been threatening us." I didn't move. I didn't scream. I just stood in the center of the dining room, my thumb hovering over the stop button on my phone. I watched as Mark tried to duck into the kitchen, his face pale and slick with sweat, looking like a rat seeking a hole in a sinking ship. "Stay where you are, sir," the lead officer barked, his hand resting on his holster. He looked at Elena, then at me, then at the man who was supposed to be in an urn on the mantel. "Ma'am, we received a call about a domestic disturbance and an unauthorized entry." "It's my house!" Elena cried, pointing a manicured finger at me. "She's a trespasser. She's mentally unstable." I stepped forward, my boots clicking firmly on the hardwood floors I had painstakingly restored. I looked the officer directly in the eye, my hand perfectly steady as I held out my phone. "My name is Sarah Vance," I said, my voice as cold as a winter morning. "And if you listen to this recording, you'll find that I'm not the one who's breaking the law. You'll also find that the man standing by the refrigerator is my husband, Mark Vance, the man who was declared dead 4 days ago in a tragic accident." The silence that followed was absolute. I pressed play. Elena's own voice filled the room, amplified and distorted by the phone's speaker. We used the body to stage the accident. Suddenly, Mark Vance is a tragic memory. The debt is wiped clean and $5 million is waiting for us. Mark let out a sound, a soft, pathetic whimper, and collapsed into a kitchen chair, burying his face in his hands. Elena, however, didn't collapse. She lunged. She flew at me with a primal roar, her fingers hooked like talons, aiming for my eyes. But the officers were faster. They tackled her to the ground, the sound of her expensive pearls snapping and scattering across the floor like tiny white teeth. "You bitch!" she screamed, her face pressed against the mahogany. "I gave you everything. I let you live in my son's shadow." I walked over to where she lay, kneeling down just enough so she had to see the lack of pity in my eyes. "You didn't give me anything, Elena. You stole my husband's soul, and he was too much of a coward to stop you. You wanted a house built on a grave? I hope you enjoy the one the state provides for you." The next few hours were a blur of flashing lights, statements, and the sterile coldness of the police station. The investigation moved with a terrifying speed once the evidence was laid bare. They found the consultant at the coroner's office within 24 hours, a man who had already been under suspicion for taking bribes. They found the body of the nobody in the grave where my husband was supposed to be. He was a homeless veteran named Thomas, a man who had survived a war only to be used as a prop in Elena's Twisted Theater. The legal fallout was a tidal wave. The insurance company didn't just deny the claim, they filed a massive civil suit for fraud. Because the transfer of the house had been predicated on a forged signature and a fraudulent death, the deed was annulled. The old Miller estate was mine again. Not that I felt I could ever sleep within those walls again. Mark tried to call me from the county jail once. I took the call, mostly because I wanted to see if I felt anything. "Sarah, please," he sobbed, his voice sounding small and distant. "I was scared. She pushed me. I did it for us, Sarah. I just wanted us to be rich, to have the life you deserved." "Don't you dare use my name to justify what you did, Mark," I said, my voice flat. "You sat in that room and toasted to my exile with champagne while I was mourning you. You didn't do it for me. You did it because you were too weak to be a man and too greedy to be a husband." "I love you," he whispered. "Love is an action, Mark, and yours was a murder. Goodbye." I hung up and never looked back. It's been a year now. The ivy on the old Miller estate has been trimmed back, and the house has a new roof, one that doesn't leak when the storms roll in. I sold the property 6 months ago. I used the money to open my own architectural restoration firm in a city 300 miles away. I don't use my father's inheritance anymore. I use the profit from my own hard work. Sometimes I sit on the porch of my new cottage, watching the sun set over a small, quiet lake. The air smells of cedar and pine, and for the first time in my life, the silence doesn't feel like something is missing. It feels like peace. Elena is serving 15 years for insurance fraud and desecration of remains. Mark took a plea deal, 10 years for his part in the scheme, and the hit and run he finally confessed to. They are exactly where they belong, in rooms they didn't choose, under rules they can't break. I take a sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth of the mug against my palms. My hands don't shake anymore. I learned a hard lesson in that beautiful, crumbling Victorian house. I learned that you can't restore something that was built on a rotten foundation. Some things are better off being torn down so that something real can finally grow in their place. Betrayal is a fire that either consumes you or forges you into something unbreakable. As I watch the stars begin to peer through the twilight, I know which one I became. After all, the most beautiful houses aren't the ones with the most expensive ornaments. They're the ones that can stand the storm and still be standing when the sun comes up.